Hey everyone, Tony D back with another video, and today Screenwriting Tips is talking about, I put it off as long as I can, romantic comedies, how to write a romantic comedy. Oh dear God. Yeah, romantic comedies are always kind of sort of in. They're especially in now with the studios still trying to aim a lot of their product at women. They tend to be movies that they don't get a tremendous wide distribution. They're more for American audiences. Again, as we talked about before, culturally speaking, it's more difficult to export comedy to other countries because they have different senses of humor. However, if you keep the comedy broad enough and less dependent upon American cultural stuff, then you can breach some of those other markets as well. What kind of stuff are we looking for in a romantic comedy? Well, obviously the romance is central to your plot. That is going to be basically running throughout the entirety of the script. The first act, you introduce the two characters that are the love interest. There's usually no mystery in a romantic comedy in that way. It's not so much the who, but about the how. So you want to introduce these two characters. You want to tend to follow the structure of a drama or a romance in that the first act should probably be about the characters either meeting, or maybe the characters had a previous romance and then broke it off and now they're getting back together. That's usually good to give the characters some history together. It depends on their age. They tend to be young. They don't tend to be, I mean, you can have high schoolers, but that's really more like coming of age, which we also talked about. It's a similar genre. You want obviously good looking protagonists. I mean, that's always a factor. And you want them in a situation that is new. And that's the real tough nut to crack in this genre. How do you make this romantic comedy new? When you look at one back from the 90s, You've Got Mail, part of the reason they did that was it was based on a newer technology at that time. Obviously, meeting people through the internet, and that was a new thing, and so naturally that was a great thing to exploit for the movie because, you know, I'm sure it had probably been done in some way, but never central to the plot like that, I guess. So those kinds of things can be very helpful in that kind of thing. Another way to do it is to cross it with a subgenre that maybe is unusual or conflated up with a story that isn't a typical romantic comedy. So my favorite romantic comedy is Shaun of the Dead, and that pitch was a romantic comedy with zombies. So that movie worked out pretty well. It was borderline. The romance was there, definitely throughout. I'm not sure if it was bigger than the comedy. I think the comedy was a little bigger, and of course the zombies pull away from some of it. There was a little bit of horror and drama in it too. But typically in a romantic comedy, you have to find that balance between the romance and the comedy. Too much romance and it's not going to be funny enough. Too much comedy and it becomes less appealing to the part of the audience that wants to see a romance because it undermines that. There was another movie with Simon Pegg. What the hell was it called? I want to say it was called Run, Fatty, Run or something like that, where he has to prepare for the marathon in order to win back the girl of his dreams. So that was an interesting movie there. He tends to go for those, gravitates towards those kinds of movies. It's a very classic setup. There's lots of advantages to doing a romantic comedy. First off, it appeals, the appeal is very broad. It appeals to men because it's comedy. It appeals to women because it's romance. that's where the balance comes in. If you skew it too much to romance, so there's a new movie out with Rebel Wilson. It's very much aimed at women. I mean, it's a romantic comedy about a woman being trapped in a romantic comedy movie. So it's a little meta, and but it's skewed more towards a female demographic, I believe. You know, a guy might go see that movie probably on a date, but it's not necessarily going to be a movie that most guys are dying to see. Whereas Shaun of the Dead would have the opposite appeal, right? Zombies tend to be more of a genre for guys because it's more horror. It tends to skew male, and you know, the comedy was a little more male-centric, so women might be turned off by some of those elements, and you know, but you probably shouldn't get hung up on that. So with this first act, you establish the two characters, you establish their past, and you establish something that's going to bring them together, whatever it is. Now, in romantic comedies, since it is a comedy, it opens up the doors to all sorts of, you know, things that defy physics, supernatural things, obviously. You could just run the gamut. As long as it's funny, and as long as it drives the story forward in terms of the romance, it's totally viable. You know, if it undermines the romance or the comedy, you got to cut it out. You gotta go back and rethink the whole thing. So, generally the tone is light. It's fun. Yes, there's going to be some kind of crisis in the second act where the two people might not get together, but generally it's not going to be that serious, right? If you look at a movie like Wedding Crashers, that's a typical plot because, you know, in a plot like that, it's about the guy winning the girl over from another guy who she's not right for. He feels he's right for her. He's the nice guy, and the guy she's with is kind of a jerk. Bradley Cooper was the jerk in that movie. So, and you know, in that Wedding Crashers, again, tends to skew, that was more of a guy-centric movie. I'm mentioning a lot of those movies because that's the kind of movie I've seen. If you look at a movie like Sex and the City, that's definitely more female-driven. Definitely, because all the main characters are female. It was a, you know, and I watched the show. I thought it was a good show. But it's definitely more aimed at women. And, you know, there are comedy elements, romance elements. That's a slightly different kind of movie in that it was based on a TV show. So there are other elements in there that kind of get mixed around. It's not just a straight up romantic comedy. There are a lot of other factors in there. You know, you're going to get some payoff from the TV show. You're going to get some payoff from the characters that have been around for a while and have a long history with the viewers. So, you know, it's not just going to be about the romance, although that was central to the plot. And in that case, you have to make it bigger than a TV plot. You know, a TV plot for a romantic comedy type show like Sex and the City might be that, you know, one of the couples has an argument, whereas a movie plot is more that the couple's going to get married, or someone finds their true love, or someone's going to get divorced and find the real person that they're going to be with. So it's definitely steeped in a lot of relationship stuff. But that's good because it's low stakes, and you know, it's not going to be about people killing each other, or probably not going to have like serious car chases or anything like that. It's going to be about people and how they interact. And ultimately, stories are about people, and that's why this genre tends to last longer. Because it's really relationship based. And if you look at any comedy, there's almost always some sort of romance in it. There's almost always an element of romantic comedy in any comedy. Even in, I talked about The Hangover and the frat boy movie video. Even in Hangover, there is some of that element. It's some of that element's between Ed Helms and Heather Graham. The prostitute he ends up marrying. Some of that's between Zach Galifianakis and Bradley Cooper, because Zach's character looks up to him and it's kind of a bromance thing. So you want to be practiced in these elements, and definitely romantic comedy is a good screenplay to write as a spec sample script. People like them. They're almost always in vogue. I haven't written a tremendous amount of them. I've written short ones. That's one trick you can do. I think works well. Write a 5-page romantic comedy or a 5-page whatever as samples. So a lot of times a producer might ask for a sample, and it usually 5 pages is about the sometimes it's as low as 3. I think I actually had a producer ask for 1 page from a script. But 5 is about the sweet spot. Also, too, those 5-minute movies are good for people who are looking for short films. So, anyhow, getting back to the 3-act structure. So you've introduced the characters in the first act. How they're going to get together is definitely going to be hinted at. Maybe they got together once and they're getting back together. The second act is going to be about all the obstacles in the way of their love, whether it's the parents that don't want them to get together, whether it's friends or rival love interest, or just the circumstances of their situation. There can be, a lot of different things. But ultimately, the third act is going to be about finding that true love, whether that true love is what was introduced in the beginning or someone else. But usually it's going to end with the serious part of the movie comes usually during the crisis moment and at the end, and then the rest of the movie is pretty light. But those 2 moments are going to anchor it, and also in the beginning too. Usually it's a good idea in any comedy is to try to start very serious, or as serious as you can, without bringing the tone too low. You don't want to make it depressing. I mean, you want to try to avoid things like having somebody die in the opening scene or something like that, unless you can somehow make that light. It's tough to make death a little too light. Even if it's a comedy, you can end up undermining the reality of the entire movie. So you don't want to generally go there, but you want to keep it pretty straightforward, pretty neutral, pretty low, pretty serious in the beginning. Definitely the crisis is going to be a serious thing. The weight that you put at the beginning is going to pay off in that crisis moment. And then finally, the end is going to be a happy ending, but it also tends to be a realistic ending in terms of the romance part. So the characters should get together in a way that makes sense romantically. They shouldn't just be hammered together. They need to, their relationship really needs to evolve. So with the comedy aspect, it's all about heightening. With the romance, it's all about progressing the romance. It's all about progressing the relationship. The characters get to know each other. I think Clueless can fall into that category. If you look, it's a classic romance where at first Paul Rudd's character kind of just thinks Alicia Silverstone is the spoiled brat and kind of not worth his time, and she's annoyed by him. It's a classic sort of like 2 people who meet and they instantly dislike each other, but really deep down there's an attraction that they're denying. So that's a very sort of classic setup, and that's fun to do. And then, of course, as the movie progresses, they get to know each other. Usually it's some sort of circumstances, some sort of hardship that brings them together. They have to work together. And in that case, I believe it was like the legal thing that happened. And, and it might be, in the case of Alicia Silverstone, she's becoming an adult. She's getting her life together. So that was important. She was maturing enough so she could be with Paul Rudd's character, who was older. And so that all works in terms of a romantic comedy. And the level of comedy you want is sort of, it's really you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you want that romantic comedy somewhere in the 4 to 7 range. You get above 7, and it's going to be crazy. I mean, it's going to be nuts because it's a comedy. And you get below 4, there's just not enough to call it a romantic comedy. It might as well be a romance. And I think that's where some movies really drop the ball. If it's a romantic comedy, there has to be funny stuff in it, like genuinely funny moments. And they should permeate throughout all 3 acts. They shouldn't just be in part of it. If there's only a funny moment in the beginning and maybe the second act, it's not enough. Usually with what a lot of people will do is they'll put the onus of the funny stuff of the movie on an extra character, a friend character, right? So you have the friend who's just a crazy friend who's always doing all the crazy things. And that allows the protagonist to be a little more straightforward. But it offers a challenge in that you have to constantly keep the friend in the mix and keep them doing all this crazy stuff, whatever they're doing. So that is definitely a strategy that I would recommend. I mean, these characters tend to be very normal people, so we want to see their friends. We want to see how their world is. That's another thing too that can be very helpful. If you create characters who have unusual occupations or they have unusual circumstance, whatever it is, stuff that maybe we've never seen in a movie before. You know, if you look at a movie like Role Models, which really isn't about the romance part of it, but you see how the characters grow in terms of their maturity, which then in turn helps them in their in the romance department with, you know, they grow up, you know, so that's, you know, less of a romantic comedy. It's probably more of a coming of age movie, but comedy romances definitely are something you should consider writing, even if you're not funny, even if you're not really planning to write a lot of them. It is something that it's pretty universal. It's pretty perennial. It's you know, it can show the lighter side of your writing, even if it's just a short movie. They're not hard, you know, to write. I mean, you're essentially, you know, worst case scenario, if you're not a funny writer, if you don't consider yourself funny, what you should sit down and do is write a romance, and then maybe collaborate or hire a comedy writer to come in and punch the thing up so it has the romantic comedy or the comedy part. And you know, that's a way to do it, because ultimately when the comedy peaks in a romantic comedy, it's not peaking at the crisis moment, and it's not peaking at the romance moment. It's peaking around it. So if the biggest moment in the movie is a comedy moment, you've probably put in a little too much comedy. If the romance isn't involved in that peak moment, in that climax, and it's just about the comedy, then you've probably got a comedy on your hands with some romance in it. But you need, for comedy romance, to have that moment where the characters who we wanted to get together get together. And you need to make them, of course, very likable. Comedy romances or romantic comedies are all about very likable and broad characters. So it's very difficult to do a romantic comedy about, you know, people who have real problems interacting with others, you know. I mean, it could be a nice contrast, but generally speaking, these sort of broad categories, if you're trying to sell something to like the Hallmark Channel, or, you know, they work as TV movies too, because they tend to be lighter and the stakes aren't that high. You know, you need to keep that very, very light and you need to tap into an audience that, would like it. So, one of the cool things to do now is to tap into nostalgia. To tap into something in the 80s or 90s or even the early 2000s, because the age of the audience that's going to go see a romantic comedy is becoming, you want people in the 30 to 40 range, usually women, who are going to go see those kinds of romantic comedies. Sometimes younger, but tends to skew, I think, a little older. Tends to be people who are, they're looking for romance in their own lives, and that's why they go to the movies. It's also true that, married people enjoy them too. I think married people will tend to enjoy those kinds of movies in a slightly different way. They're not watching them to feel the romance per se, so much as it's more of a compromise between a couple and a movie that they'll both watch. And has half the elements that they kind of both like. But, all right. So that's romantic comedies for screenwriting tips. My name is Tony D. Check me out at the Webcomic Factory at Superfrat. My webcomics are there. And you can also throw me a couple bucks at Patreon or BitChute, or I don't know if Daily Motion. I'm on that one now. And, of course, YouTube. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.